Okay, so let's look at reading XML data in a Silverlight application. I've got this page.xaml file over here, and we've got a data grid. And on the data grid, I have said that the item source is data bound. And I've also said that we have two columns. One is data bound to a property called customer, and one is data bound to a property called total sales. And back on my site of origin, I have this file data.xml. Data.xml comes from the Northwind database, where we have customers that have orders, that have items, that have prices and quantity. And what I'm going to do is write an XML query which will bring back the prices multiplied by their quantity. We'll group them up and sum them on a per customer basis, and then produce a sort of results table, if you like, and put that into the data grid on the screen. Now, it's important to realize that the XML API that we have for Silverlight is the link to XML API. So I'm going to go to my project down here, and I'm going to add a reference to system.xml.link so that I can use that. And then let's pop to the code behind here. Now, normally, if you've looked at the link to XML API before, you'd be very familiar with the class xElement. We'll call that XML. And what you'd usually do is xElement.load, and you might think, because that parameter says URI, that we could pass data.xml there. Let me just collapse these namespaces down. And this would just work. However, that would work if data.xml was packaged as part of the ZAP for my Silverlight application. But it won't work for the site of origin that we have here. So that isn't necessarily going to work quite the way we'd expect. There's a couple of ways that we could load up this XML file. So what we'll do here is we'll load the file asynchronously. We'll use the web client class, which we've used previously. We'll call this client. We'll create one of those, and we'll ask it that when the read completes, let me just go and collapse those namespaces back down. When the read completes, we'll ask for notification. So we'll say on read completed, and let me just get rid of all this text. And then we'll say client dot open read async data. In fact, a new URI, data.xml, and a URI kind of relative. So we're going and asking for that thing, and when the read completes down here, we get given a stream from which we can read. So now we can say xElement, let's say XML equals xElement.load, and we need to provide the stream that we want. So one of the things we can pass as an argument here is an XML reader. So we'll say XML reader dot create e.result, and that's going to be the stream which goes into a reader which gets the XML element to load. Okay, let's write a query. So we'll say query equals, and we're trying to reach into the XML, grab these items. We want to group up their prices by their quantities for the customer and sum them at the same time. So we'll say from I in XML dot descendants and self that are called item. Let's pull out the customer ID. So CID equals the string that you get by looking at the item, searching up its ancestors for customer elements, getting the first one of those, getting its attribute called ID as a string. And then we'll say let's group up, and what we want to group up is the decimal value you can get by looking at I and its attribute called price, multiplied by the integer value you can get from I and its attribute called quantity. And we'll group those up into, let's call this grouped sales. We'll introduce another temporary variable. Total sales is group sales dot sum. We'll order by total sales descending, and we'll select a new record. Now I've got a data type in my project here called sales data, and sales data has a customer and total sales. So we can create a list of those things. A new sales data, and on that sales data let's have customer equals. Well, that's going to be grouped sales dot key. That's just a link thing as to how groupings work. And we're going to have total sales equals, and we'll have group sales. Actually, it's total sales, isn't it? We've already worked that out. Now we forgot to group by something. That's why my IntelliSense is kicking in. We should be grouping by customer ID. Okay, it's fine. So we've got that query back. We've got that query back, and we should be able to go and turn that into a list and data bind it. So we want to go back to our original UI, which had a data grid on it that was contained within a layout grid. The data grid is binding its item source, and the grid is binding. The grid is called layout root. So we can change the data context on this and affect the binding of that. So let's go back to our code, and we'll say layout root dot data context equals query dot toList. Just convert that into a list. Let's see if we can build. Well, we should be able to build. Let's see if we can run, and hopefully that is going to bring down that XML asynchronously. When we pick it up, we bring it into link to XML, we convert it into object data using a link to XML query, and we get our results back from the database pretty easily and onto the screen. So it's not so much about the data grid, and it's not so much about the asynchronous nature. It's the fact that we have the link to XML API available to us, and we can write link queries against XML data and make use of that from our Silverlight applications. Quickly, what if we wanted to create some XML? So imagine that we wanted to get back at some point from the UI the data that we've got and turn it into XML. So perhaps what we can do is simply go back to our UI. Let's go and put a couple of rows into our grid. We'll say grid.row definitions, and we'll add a couple of row definitions in there, and then we'll go ahead and put a button into the second row. So we'll go and just say we'll have a button, and that grid.row is 1, and the content of that button is generate XML, let's call it, and click is going to be equal to onClick, something like that. So very simply we've done that, and we can then pop back to our code that lives behind here. Let's write that onClick method. So we'll just say onClick, and in here what we want to do is grab the data context, which is a list of sales data records. So let's just collapse some of these functions so we get more space on the screen here. So what we'll do is we'll just say let's get layout root.data context, and let's cast that up as a list of sales data records. So we'll call that data as a list of sales data, and then what we'd want to do is turn that back into XML. So we could say x element equals, let's say XML equals, and what we'll do is create a new x element. We'll have a slightly different shape of XML. Let's have sales summary or something like that, and inside there what we're going to do is we're going to query this data here. So we can say from SD in data, let's select a new X element for every one of those entries. We'll say sales record or something like that, and into that X element let's put a couple of attributes. We'll have customer, which is going to be sd.customer, and we'll have another attribute which is going to be sales, which is going to, sales is going to be sd.total-sales. Close a few braces, make some XML, and then we could go and take this XML and do something with it. We might persist it in isolated storage, we might call off to a web service with it, we might really do anything you want with it. All I'll do here is say put a breakpoint so that we can view the XML. Let's press F5. So what we should be doing now is loading the XML from the website asynchronously on load, turning that into a list of objects, binding that into the data grid, and rather a big button here, but when we click the button we should be taking that back into XML, and if we have a look at this guy, we should be able to go and just see if we hover over it and get the visualizer. There's the XML that we just created. We could go and do whatever you want with this at this point. So pretty easy to go back into XML using link to XML here inside of Silverlight.